Yeah, so thank you, Carmen and Vincent, for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to present the work. So my name is Rainer Simon. I work for a place called the Austrian Institute of Technology, which is a research center based in Vienna in Austria. And for the past couple of years, I had the honor and the pleasure of working with a group of people in a project called Pelagios. Yeah, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we have done in Pelagios over the past time, and also, as Carmen said, how we collaborating with the Pittsburgh World Historical Gazetteer in the modeling of places, in the development of tools for working with geohistorical spatial data sets. Yeah, so what will this talk be about today? Yeah, so first of all, I will be introducing Pelagios to those who don't know what Pelagios is. We will be talking a little bit about linked open data. Pelagios is a linked open data project. If you're not familiar with the concept, I will also explain a little bit what linked open data is and why it is useful and why we think it makes sense to produce linked data. Yeah, I'll be talking about gazetteers. That's the most important aspect about, or the most important type of linked data that Pelagios works with. At this point, I'm going to switch over and introduce the Pittsburgh World Historical Gazetteer that has sort of joined us on the stage of this field. And I will be talking about places and traces. Those are two central concepts and central terms that we have come to use in both Pelagios and the Pittsburgh project. I will also be talking a little bit about knowledge graphs. That's another buzzword, I would say. Maybe a little bit of an overused buzzword sometimes, but still it's an important concept. And gazetteers, so dictionaries of places, make an important element of knowledge graphs, and I will show you a little bit of an example for how that looks like in different institutions. Yeah, and finally, how all this fits hopefully together and what is useful about it. Okay, without further ado, so what is Pelagios? So Pelagios is basically a series of research projects. We've been funded by the Mellon Foundation, that's a private American foundation funding the humanities, since the last 5 years, and we will have more funding from them until the end of this year. So that's sort of the one phase of Pelagios, but that's not all of it. It has also become a growing community initiative, so a wider network of volunteers, of people who basically discuss issues of linking data about places of the past. So this is really what we do. We have people who have data, historical data, archaeological data, literature, all kinds of different materials, and they share one common goal of making this data interoperable and sharing it in easier ways. So my background is I'm a computer scientist, so I'm developing also the tools, or I'm sort of the lead developer for the tools that we develop. There are specifically two tools. One's called Recogito. It's an annotation tool for texts and images. And the other thing is called Peripleo. That's more of a demo and a prototype for a search engine for linked open data for places. And I'll be showing examples of those in a minute. Yeah, and finally, so Pelagios will soon transition into an association. So we're becoming more of an open kind of network, not just the getting more independent of the projects. That's the goal. And within the next couple of weeks, we will have a membership structure and open forums where you can join the discussion and so on. Yeah, so what's the motivation? What's sort of the basic idea behind Pelagios? So we've been working on projects, on problems that are very sort of well known to people working in the library domain, in the archives domain, but also scholars. So one of those problems is if you have data or if you want to use data from an institution, how can you find it? So how do you enable findability of resources, or how do you improve findability of resources? The other thing is once you find it, how can you make it accessible? So there's a bit of a problem. So we can see here those bookshelves with chains to them. Nowadays we don't have chains anymore, we can have paywalls, so that automate this process. So the question is, how can we make sort of a more culture of openness? It's also the open and linked open data. What about licensing and so on? It's also a big issue of sort of bringing people together to discuss on how to, and how and why to make their resources more open. Finally, reusability, that is of course sort of a licensing issue on the one hand, but it's also a technical issue. How do you make data interoperable, that other people can reuse it in different systems? It's also a question of usability, really from the user's point of view. How do you make it easy for users to use data that's coming from a different source? So basically, it's these 3 or 4 things: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. Some of you may also know this as the FAIR principles. So that's really sort of the kind of the big motivation behind the Pelagios project. Yeah, mostly a summary of what I just said. In Pelagios, I should also add the background that we're coming from is very much in the classics. So it's people dealing with ancient literature and inscriptions, and also archaeology from classical Greece and classical Rome. So that was sort of the seed where we grew from. But even in this sort of still kind of small domain, there's an amazing variety of the types of data that you encounter. So we worked with partners in museums, we worked with scholars having their own databases of, for example, ancient ports or people, lists of time periods, also bigger collections of coins, any kind of data. So it's heterogeneity in terms of the type of data, but also in terms of the technology behind it. So on the one hand, you have the work of individual scholars, which might just sit in a spreadsheet or an Excel file or in a Word document. On the other end of the scale, you have the big museum collections or library collections which have huge databases, and then anything in between, really. So outputs from research projects, websites that list resources. All of this is really valuable material for a scholar, but it's not easy to combine, it's not easy to reuse. So the question is, what can you do about it? And the sort of the seed idea that we had in Pelagios was to use authority files, or at least start getting across the idea that if people can agree on the use of common authority files, that you can bring a little bit of order into this kind of diversity. And specifically, as I said, we've been talking about gazetteers. So the place as an ordering principle of data has been the idea of Pelagios. Or in other words, in more technical terms, maybe we can say that Pelagios develops conventions for publishing places and traces as linked open data. Places, as I said, that's through gazetteers, digital directories of places where every place is a record and every record has information about the place that you can use as a scholar and you can use in a search engine or whatever. And traces is the concept that I will be talking about a little bit more detail later. That's data that is linked to places. Typical case in the Pelagios would be archaeological data. So you have an object, it's connected to a place where it was found, it might be connected to a place where it was shipped to, and it might be connected to a place where it's now housed in a museum. So all these kinds of places that an object can live through, that's what we define as a trace of it, which we started to call traces. Yeah, so all of this is published as linked data. The question, if you haven't heard about linked data before, what is linked data actually? So linked data is basically a way to publish data about things in the real world, and it can be any kind of thing in the real world. Most importantly, I think people and places can be something that you can publish and expose as linked data. To stick with a classical example here, maybe we have Alexander the Great here, and he might be connected. So there is a connection between Alexander and all the various cities that he founded, for example. There's just 3 of the many or 30-something Alexandrias that he founded. So linked data is basically a way to say, here's a person, I have a record for this person, here are some places, I have records for these places, and there is a connection, there is a link. I can also say something about what type of link that is, but that's not so much important maybe in the first instance. It's really about having data about things in the world and links between them. Can also be events, maybe battles that he fought. Could also be objects like inscriptions or literature in general. So there might be literature that mentions him, for example. That's another type of link between an object, like a piece of literature, and the connection could be it mentions that person or it mentions that place. And of course it expands outwards. So, another example, coins that depict him. So again, you have an object, and the connection would be there is a depiction of this person. And then it extends outwards, so there's indirect connections. Other people, for example, connected to that person through events, joint battles, for example. Or other places. The inscription that mentions that person was found in that place and is now located in the British Museum in London or whatever. And finally, you can have entirely different things like a movie poster or something like a popular culture, essentially. So the strength of linked data is that you don't need to stay in a domain, but it's really a tool also for crossing domains and bringing in very different material. So why is this useful? Yeah, on the one hand, it's more information, and all this information is connected. That's the one thing, of course. But also the information is more varied, so you can have very different kinds of things from different domains, contributed by different people, so you can actually have different sort of perspectives on the data. That's sort of a strength that you can have when you use this kind of distributed approach. It can be information that complements existing metadata, so you have on the one hand maybe the scholarly metadata from a library catalog or from a museum, but you can also have contributed data from scholars, so you get multiple perspectives, you get multiple readings of a bit different piece of literature, for example, different narratives and interpretations. So that's really one of the strengths of linked data, that you can basically integrate that. Of course, in a technical level, there's also advantages that you can use this data. So this data is machine readable, so machines can do something with it. So you can use this to build search engines, you can use this to build maps and enable discovery. You can do computation on this data, and you can do different kinds of visualizations and so on. So it's sort of this thing of, on the one hand, having this as a structure for exploration, but also to do computation. So finally, the question, how do we make linked data? So that's sort of where the tricky part starts. So as I said, it's machine-readable data, so we have to produce data in a way that can be understood by machines. But still, the semantic web, or the semantic in semantic web, always comes from humans. So you can't really expect machines to produce linked data from nowhere. It's really a strongly human-guided process. So there is lots of effort that has to go in to make linked data. And it's a joint effort between humans and machines, basically. So on a technical level, there are some framework things that you should know. I don't want to go too deep into the details, but I still want to mention the important terms that you will usually hear when you hear about linked data. On the one hand, that will be the term unique resource identifier, so a URI. A URI is a unique code that you assign to an object in the real world. So everything that's addressed in this graph of linked data has to have basically an identifier. So Alexander has to have an identifier in your database, essentially. All the places have to have different identifiers. They might have the same names, but they have different identifiers. It's sort of like a social security number for a thing in the real world on the web. And importantly, a unique resource identifier is just an abstract kind of technical term, but you all know a specific type of URI, and that's the URL. So a browser address that you type into a browser is also a URI. And for linked data, that's kind of the key. So every identifier in the linked data world also has to be a web address. So if we can type it into a browser, we can get information about the thing that it identifies. For example, typical examples, if you go to Wikipedia, there's /wiki/Paris. That's something that you can actually use as an identifier for Paris on the linked data web. It gives you some information about Paris, maybe not the perfect information, but at least it gives you an address. Or those who have already worked with Wiki Data or with linked data, they will be aware of something called Wiki Data, which is more like a database or a linked data version of Wiki Data, where everything that's in Wiki Data, in Wikipedia, also has a Wiki Data URI. And the difference is mainly that Wiki Data is this kind of machine-readable version of Wikipedia. So that's sort of the real linked data identifier for Paris. Just the number doesn't tell you as a human so much, but it's the identifier for Paris in this case. So that's the first step. You need to identify things in the real world. The second step is that we need a language to encode the whole network. So once we have the identifiers, we need a language that computers can understand, which we can use to build that kind of graph. And there's a term that you will come across if you work with linked data. It's called RDF, or the Resource Description Framework. Well, Wikipedia says it's a family of World Wide Web Consortium specifications originally designed as a metadata model, and it has become to be used as a general method for conceptual description or modeling of information that is implemented in web resources. No need to dive into too much detail what it means, but it's really a language for computers to encode sort of simple statements based on URIs. And this down here, that's such a statement. So in RDF, every statement consists of these three kinds of elements. So there's a subject, a predicate, and an object. The subject could say Paris, the predicate is a, and the object place. So a computer can understand Paris is a place. So a very simple statement. And of course, everything in there is a URI. So for computers, the subject is a URI, as we've seen before. Also, the predicate is a URI, so it has a concept for is a, and also the type of place. Place is also a concept that the computer identifies somehow. And finally, there's something called ontologies, prosopographers, and gazetteers. So these are the vocabularies from where we pull those kind of concepts, right? So it's a formalized language. It's basically a list of things. If we say place is a concept, we need a long list of possible places that implement this concept in a way. And that's a gazetteer, right? So a gazetteer is a list of places and their URIs that belong to them. And prosopographies, digital prosopographies would do the same thing for people. And ontologies do the same thing for all kinds of relations between things in the world, essentially. So if this sounds kind of alien to you, that's basically where Pelagios starts to bring order, bring some support, basically, on how to deal with this. So where does Pelagios help? On the one hand, it's just a community, right? So it provides a forum for discussion. It collects best practices. It gets people together to talk and exchange those best practices and exchange knowledge about tools. So that production of linked data basically becomes easier for those who are doing it. We also develop specifications, so basically cooking recipes for specific types of linked data, specifically with regard to place, of course. For example, if you want to build your own gazetteer, your own list of places with linked data identifiers. And that's a specification I will talk in more detail. It's called the linked places model. Or linked open data that links to places more generally, and that's a linked traces model. So those are specifications that are developed not by Pelagios, but by the members of the community that Pelagios has sort of started to support. And finally, as I said, we also developed some end-user tools to make this a more usable experience. Recogito and Peripleo, as I said. So without further ado, so this is a quick some impressions from Recogito. Recogito is a tool where you upload, for example, a text or an image, a map, for example, and you can start to annotate phrases in there. For example, if the text mentions places, you just annotate the place. You click a button, the window pops up, and you can say, okay, this is a place. For the map, for example, just to stay with the example on screen. So you mark the box, and it mentions a place on the map, and you transcribe it in the way it's written on the map. You say, okay, that's a place, and you search it in a gazetteer, and you can create a link. And this way you have already created one of those triples, for example. So this piece of the map has the transcription Keflavik, and this piece of the map is an attestation to the place Keflavik in Iceland, for example. And the same thing, as I said, for texts. It's very easy. You can also make those kinds of connections and relations between people and places, so you can start to build, essentially you can start to build those networks out of sources. Right, and Peripleo, that's the second piece of software. That's something different. I mean, there exist some connections, but Peripleo is more a search engine for database type content, so it's not so much literature in a way, but it's, if you have a database of coins, for example, you can put it in there, and you can put other databases in there too, archaeological databases or other coin datasets from museums. And let's see if I can get this running again. In this example, we search for tetradrachm. That's a type of Greek coin, and if you search for that, you get some 20,000 hits. You can see how they're spread across space. You can see the footprint. You can also see the footprint across time. You can filter. The nice thing, of course, is that you can see material that actually comes from different sources. So it's multiple databases that are indexed in there. It's not just one collection, but it's multiple collections. So, and this is basically where the linked places data model comes in, because this is what's running underneath the hood of both of these tools. So what is the linked places data model? It's a joint development by us and the World Historical Gazetteer. I put joint development in quotes because really, so it's led by Karl Grosner, and Karl has done most of the work, and we're just hanging on to it. So much of this has been done by Karl. Although Carl has also taken on board the concepts that we started to play with, he's just sort of brought them in order and developed a more comprehensive specification. Yeah, so it significantly extends the scope, how you can, or what you can represent in a gazetteer. Of course, once you have modeled your gazetteer in the linked places format, it is RDF, so it is compliant with this language that you need to build linked data. It's something called JSON LD. That's a sort of more simplified way, or let's say JSON LD is RDF, but it's also a format called JSON, which is very popular to build web applications. So it's a bit easier to handle for technological people, but it's still RDF. And it's also GeoJSON. That's a different type of format, which is very commonplace for people who work with geographical information systems. So it bridges kind of different domains. On the one hand, the semantic web and GIS and web development. So it's a pretty neat kind of idea that Carl has come up with. Yeah, so what are the core ideas behind the linked places data model? So first of all, the linked places model considers places to be conceptual entities. It's not about the geometry. It's not a point on the world or on the surface of the earth, but it's, so as according to Carl, if stuff happened there, if something happened there with human intervention or natural intervention and people talked about it and gave it a name, then it is a place. So it's really a conceptual thing. A place has names typically, or it should have names. It can be a place where you saw something happened there, but it has no name, so that's also possible. So all this is basically optional, but there can be names. There can be geometry, so it can have a polygon or a point or a line. It can have feature types, so it means it could be a mountain, it could be a mill, it could be a port or whatever. And it can have relations to other places, so there can be administrative relations, there can be connections, cultural connections, so it could be a colony from, I don't know, a Greek colony in Sicily or whatever. And there can be lots of other metadata, of course. So there can be descriptions, there can be images of the place, depictions, there can be, of course, bibliographic citations, and there can be links to other authorities. So as we said, linked data, and I will go into detail with some other examples. So there is no single gazetteer for the whole world, but people come up with their own gazetteers, so there is a myriad of gazetteers. And it's very important for linked data to work that people build those connections. If I have my gazetteer, I should also create connections to Carmen's gazetteer, for example, if it's possible. So they can also have those kind of links. And specifically of importance for historical gazetteer, of course, pretty much everything in the linked places model can be scoped by time. So a place can be like Alexandria, for example, or the Alexandria in what's now in Egypt, exists for a very long time. It has changed names. It has changed sort of administrative associations and rulerships. You could still consider it the same place. You might not do that, but that's a different kind of discussion. But at least things about the place have changed. So you can model name changes, you can model geometry changes. I think you can actually model things like splits and merges, although that gets tricky, but so basically it's all sort of in the model. So I'm sorry I have to do present some kind of code and some kind of technical background here. So this is what a record or a minimal record looks like in the linked places format. So that's the kind of thing which is machine readable and which the computer can understand. But I would say it's still fairly readable for a human if you know where to look. And in more detail, so the important things that are in there is, on the one hand, as I said, every place needs an ID. So every place, first of all, needs an identification URI. Could really be anything. It's just important that you have your own kind of maybe website or your own project and a number which identifies. So this is something that people can look up and get information about your place. Then there's something called type feature. I would sort of skip over that. That's basically to make it more compatible with other data formats. So feature is sort of a term which comes from GeoJSON. So in order to use this in a geographical information system, it has to be a feature. So it's not really a part of the linked places data model, but that's sort of an interoperability mechanism in a way. So next, we basically mandate a title, because if you don't even have any kind of title, it could still be a valid place, of course, but it's not really useful for users. So in the end, you want to search for this place somehow, and something needs to be shown to the user. So we tell people you have to have a title for the place in order to make this usable for users. And then the interesting parts start. So of course you can have names, as many as you want. Really, the key thing is every place has to have one toponym at least. So there is a toponym. All other things are optional, basically. You can assign a language if you know a language for this toponym. You can provide a citation for this toponym if it comes from a historical source. And important, you can have this when object, which allows you to scope it by time. You can say, okay, it existed from this to this date or in this period, and there will be some examples later on, because when has quite an elaborate mechanism already to use different types of referring to time. Yeah, geometry, points, polygons, whatever. So that's also basically the GIS part of the model, which allows you to ultimately make maps out of this. And links. As I said, here we have connections from my place in my gazetteer to places in other gazetteers, like some gazetteer wherever, or also geonames, which I'm sure you know as sort of an online gazetteer. Yeah. So what does that do? Essentially, it's a mechanism for connecting different databases. So everybody has their own database, and we want to get rid of that. We want to connect different databases. And this is a small example here for Athens. As I said, Pelagios has this kind of classical scope. And this is how people from different gazetteers refer to each other. So every dot is one record in a gazetteer. So this is geonames, Athens. And this is Athens in a gazetteer called the Digital Atlas of the Roman Empire. And this is Athens in a gazetteer called Pleiades. And they all have those links. So they all build those kind of networks between each other. They can also have different strengths. In this case, they can say, okay, here's my Athens, and it's the ancient Athens, and I want to connect it to geonames, which has actually the modern Athens, the capital of Greece. I still want to have this link, but I want also to say that this is not the same, right? It's not the same, but I still want to have discoverability, sort of this dashed arrow here, which just uses a different kind of relation. Yeah, maybe some examples of what that has achieved in Pelagios. This is a nice example, I think. It's a place called Mersin that's in Turkey, and it's a small network, and I want to direct sort of your attention to this here. So that's the record for Mersin in the gazetteer of the German Archaeological Institute. And before we had their record, there was essentially this group here, which is a Wiki Data and geonames, so it's sort of the modern web. And down here we had a community of people studying the ancient world, and Pleiades is a gazetteer, which is very accepted in the ancient world, and everybody has linked their record for Mersin to Pleiades, but there was no connection between them, so they would not know about the Wiki Data record for Mersin. And then when the German Archaeological Institute came in, they had connections to both of them, so they joined those two graphs and created a bridge. What's also interesting, sort of the negative thing about it, so the German Archaeological Institute always uses the same relation saying exact match, right? So they simply do this because they don't have a notion of link type. They just say, okay, we have links, only one type of link, and the way we give it to Pelagios is we give them an exact match. So if you're like a purist of the semantic web, what that now says is you can infer that modern day Mersin in Turkey today is the same as the ancient town of Mersin some thousands of years ago. That, of course, is not a right inference to make. But in Pelagios, it was never the real big issue because it's more about discoverability. But this is really sort of the trade-off in a way. So you need to be aware of these kinds of things because they can really mess up your use of the data. So that's an important thing. Just another example, sort of the inverse. That's Tokra, I think. That's a place in Libya. And again, here, so it's a bit more difficult to see, but again, here's the record in the German Archaeological Institute for that place. And that was an interesting thing because you can see here that the German Archaeological Institute, in this case, had no links at all. So they didn't know anything about Tokra in all the other databases. They joined Pelagios and they imported the data. And because somebody else, in this case, this dot here is the Historical Gazetteer of Libya. It's a very well-curated resource. They already had set a link to the German Archaeological Institute. So they come in with no links. they get connected automatically because somebody else in the community had already done the work. And so again, they join the network and they get all these other connections to the database. So that's sort of the inverse thing which happens. Right, so that's basically where we stopped, or where we sort of left off in Pelagios, and this is where the World Historical Gazetteer from Pittsburgh entered the stage. It started in 2017 as a 3-year project funded by the National Endowment of the Humanities. That's sort of a funding agency in the States for specifically humanities projects. They got a grant from 2017 to 2020 to build, on the one hand, to further the development of these standards, but not just that, but also to build a data store and associated software and services for collaborative data-driven historical scholarship at the global scale. So that's sort of a big aspiration, I would say. But the point is they are also building infrastructure where you can actually deposit this in the long term. So for Pelagios and Peripleo, which you've just seen, is really a technology demo. So we can upload data, we can play with it, but we have no funding to continue this for the next 10 years. But they have funding to build this, and they also have the commitment of the university to operate it for the next 10 years. We sort of started to think where Pelagios and World Historical Gazetteer differ. So we sort of started to say, so Pelagios is probably returning to the focus to the ancient world, and the World Historical Gazetteer is interested in anything early modern and more modern. I'm not sure this is such a hard boundary, but basically at the moment the WHG project is focusing predominantly at everything after the Middle Ages, basically. Yeah, it's run from the University of Pittsburgh by Ruth Moston and Carl Grosner, who are the project lead and the technologist, Ryan Horn and Patrick Manning and David Rulo. So it's a small group. It's basically the same as Pelagios. We're also 5 people, plus a community that's growing around it, which is really much bigger. Right, just some impressions from the World Historical Gazetteer. So they will be making a first public release of the tools that they're building in July, I think. But essentially, they are building, on the one hand, sort of gazetteer interfaces, place pages that you can enter. You can search for places, you get information about them, like here. But they also build reconciliation tools. So if you have a gazetteer dataset, you can upload your dataset and you can let the system find those links for you. So the system would compare places that you upload to places that are already in the system, create those links, and then allow you to review those. So it's still the kind of manual process is still very strong in there. And that's, I don't think you can really avoid it. What you see here, for example, is the authority match validator, as the tool is called, does an automatic pass first, and then you go through it and say, okay, that's a correct match and that's not the correct match. It actually works quite similar to the to Recogito, the annotation tool that I've shown just before, because when you click in Recogito on a place, you also get an automatic suggestion, and you have to confirm it or correct it in order to actually be a valid match. Yeah, so that's one thing, the gazetteer part, so the conventions about publishing places and the data format for publishing places. And the second thing is the traces. So what are traces? Originally, this was a term, again, coined by Carl. So Carl has always been interested in type of modeling journeys and flows, either journeys by historical people and persons, but also things like trade routes and trade connections. And he has originally used the term trace to refer this kind of movement through space and time. And once we came in from Pelagios and joined with them, we said, actually, it's a nice term to use for anything that's sort of anchored in space and time somehow. So you can use it as a term for literature. If you have a piece of literature that talks about places in time, it's also in a way a trace. So it's a human activity that you can map based on a source or a physical artifact or whatever. In the World Historical Gazetteer, there's a first interface that you can see already where you search for maybe a journey and you get all those points connected, which is the trace for this particular item. So the way to model this for machines is actually quite similar. It looks almost the same. What's different here is that it comes in 2 parts, right? So there is one thing here up there and another block here. That's because you're separately modeling the object and you are separately modeling the connection, because the connection is kind of a thing which can carry rich metadata on its own. In both cases, what they have in common, both have to be, again, sort of objects in the linked data sense, so they have to have their identifiers and their URIs, and they have to have types. So on this case, you can see it's an artifact, whatever. And the LPO stands for linked places ontology. So there is no good vocabulary on what types of artifacts there exist. So we said, okay, we probably need our own vocabulary, and that's what's sort of being developed right now. The types of things that you can have in traces. And down here, this is a type of annotation. That's nothing that we invented, but there is actually a standard for that, which is called the W3C web annotation format, which gives you the opportunity to basically use annotation as a link with extra information attached to it. So it's not more than that. It's really just a link between things, but there is much more information that you can pack into the nature of that link. So that's the one thing. Yeah, and then for the item, I only have two examples here. It can have a title, it can have a subject, but there's all sorts of metadata that you may want to associate to that. There are really no sort of limits. For the annotations have some specific concepts and some specific terminology that comes from this web annotation standard. One term which you will run into if you use this format is the type of the term of the target. So the target is where the annotation points to. And it's basically this connection. So you say, okay, here's an annotation. And the target of the annotation, or the thing that it annotates, is this. So you create the connection, again, by using the URIs of the things. And then it has a body. That's the second term from the web annotation format. That's basically what the annotation contains, the information that you are saying about the object. In this case, you're saying, okay, so there's a find spot, and I want to pack the find spot in the annotation. The find spot is a place in my gazetteer, which has this ID. And because I want to make it more usable, I also provide the title for my gazetteer, which is Copan. In this case, you have, as an example, it's an artifact, it's a Maya statue, and you want to annotate the statue with the find spot, which is Copan. And all this in the linked data fashion. That's what you do with this here. Right, so, and in sense, you end up with this kind of two-tiered hierarchy. On the one hand, you have the places up here. The places have those kind of connections that we've seen in the graphs before. And at the bottom, you have all your items. Your items could be connected too, but basically through those annotations, you're building the connections between the places and the items. And that's what the traces are, essentially. And that really is sort of a core of a knowledge graph. And if you've heard the term knowledge graph, it's become popular with the sort of the Google knowledge graph, which is those small boxes that you see on the side of Google search results, where you search for a person, and then you have the person, like the image of the person, you have other people related to it. So that's information that's pulled from Google's own knowledge graph. But of course, knowledge graphs have existed as a concept before. Sometimes they are referred to in synonymous ways as an ontology. It's maybe not quite the same, but essentially it's kind of connections and types of connections that you can use in ways that Google uses them, or for visualizations that Pelagios and the Pittsburgh World Historical Gazetteer builds. Right, quickly, maybe just some more examples of how places and traces are in Peripleo. So as I said, we sort of started playing with the concept before we had a proper name for it. But basically, if you search for a type of coin, you can get all those dots. Essentially, they're all traces, but one place can have many traces, because many traces could be many find spots, for example. And vice versa, you could have one trace, or one piece of literature in this case, and it can be many places on the map. And remember that one place record is, even if in Peripleo, if you search for a place, you get one box, or in Google, you get one box for the search result. But internally, really, it's always kind of a network of information that gets fused from many different sources. Right, maybe just a word on time. I said that in both of these formats, you can add scoping by time. So there's this kind of when object here. When can just carry a timestamp where you can say, okay, here's a toponym, and it was started in 1600, and it's still used today, so it's like an open interval. But you can have other things as well. You can have a period, for example. If you don't know a date, you can just say, okay, it was used in the Hellenistic period. Or it was used in a period which I don't have an exact start date, but I know it started at least there and the start ended there. So it's kind of a fuzzy logic kind of periods. Yeah, you can just give a label. If you have no identifier for the period at all, you can just say, okay, it wasn't a period, I don't know, Upper Austrian Bronze Age or whatever. And you can also do dating via chronology. So even if you don't want to give exact dates or have no period, you can say it was dated in the period which follows this period or is being followed by this period. So it's sort of relative dating is possible as well. In Pelagios, we haven't really made use of this. In Peripleo, we played a little bit. So there are, again, it's difficult to see, but if you search for an item, you can see what periods were assigned to the item, and you can get a count of what other items would be linked to the same period. So it's kind of this navigation graph is there. In Recogito, it's also not built in, but people are sort of using it a little bit to tag time in documents, and then they're sort of abusing the system a little to get around this. So, but it's really an open issue at the moment. Right, so that's basically the things that are there. Many open conceptual issues, of course. Discussions that often come up or that come up repeatedly is, when is a place actually a place? So we are dealing a lot with literature, so there are fictional places, there are mythical places. So the good thing about gazetteers, you can actually capture them. So Hades or, I don't know, fictional islands in the Mediterranean where Odysseus would sail to, you can't map them, but you can give them an identifier. Also, you have places where you know there was a place, but you don't know where it was, because maybe it's attested to in literature, but nobody knows where. So places don't need to have a geometry. They can still be represented in the gazetteer. And there's uncertainty in all possible ways. So you can have uncertainty about the location. You cannot have uncertainty about the time. You can have uncertainty about the existence, or maybe if it's literature, you don't know exactly which place was meant by this kind of inscription. Yeah, all sorts of possible issues here. And also, until when is a place the same place? So many people ask, okay, if I have a place and it changes considerably, when's the time there where I have to assign a new identifier? Or is it always the same place? Names change, geometries change, places split, places merge, places move, rulership changes and so on. So there is always quite, there are many things that you can, many decisions that you make on when you, how long do you keep it the same identifier, the same place? When do you split your identifiers? And there are no real answers to that. So it's really something that really you can only solve in discussion with the community and also thinking about the technology that you're using and how you want the user interface to look like. So many kinds of things come in there. And I think Pelagios is also great because it offers a forum for these kinds of discussions. Yeah, even with traces, sometimes it's not even easy to decide when something is a place and when something is a trace. Monuments, are those traces? Are they places? I would say they are places because they're static. Inscriptions, you can move them away. So many have moved to London, for example, or Paris, of course, too. Are they still places? They're probably not, but they might be traces. So it's really difficult to decide these kinds of things once you start getting into it. And sometimes it's a decision that you simply have to have as a compromise based on how you organize your data right now. So there are no really wrong or right answers there. Barriers, even more sort of bad news. So all of this requires an enormous amount of manual work. So there are no really automatic tools. No matter what people tell you about machine learning, there is no algorithm that will solve this for you. It's hard work or sweat, as we have heard today. Data cleaning, quality control, scripting. Even if you have structured data, getting it out and making linked data out of it might require programming and things like that. Alignment with other gazetteers is always a decision process. There are many decisions that you can maybe store in the model, but there's no standard ways to store it in the model. So all those kind of decisions might get lost. It's really difficult. So no one-size-fits-all solutions. And yeah, if you're working with unstructured content, my personal opinion is that's actually still the easier part. If you have lots of content, you can at least do named entity recognition, and you can more easily go through it with tools, including Recogito, for example. But mapping databases, mapping huge quantities of data from a museum or for a library, that's really a different kind of magnitude and a different kind of challenge. And last but not least, all this requires infrastructure. You need to host those URIs. As we said, URIs alone are not sufficient. They need to be dereferenceable, which means you need to be able to type them in the browser and retrieve this information, which means somebody needs to set up the website. That requires money. So again, lots of challenges from a purely economical perspective too. But I think there are some good news too. As I keep saying, so knowledge graphs are not built in a day. We don't need to solve everything all at once. A nice example which I always like to give is from the German Archaeological Institute, to come back to them. So they have a pretty nice knowledge graph, which I think they actually started around their gazetteer. So it's also a nice example from the Pelagios perspective. So they're calling this the IDAI gazetteer for the Deutsches Archäologisches Institut. And the I think it's just like being cool like Apple. I don't know what it stands for. The DAI gazetteer is a web service which connects toponyms with coordinates and is meant to work in two directions. Internally, it serves as the authority file for all geo-related information and information systems of the German Archaeological Institute, but it is also supposed to connect this data with other worldwide gazetteer systems. And I think that sort of shows this twofold value. On the one hand, of course, they want to share the data and they are openly licensing it and they align to other gazetteers. But primarily, they're really using it to organize their data internally. So they have lots of diverse data, and it's a tool for them to organize their own data, first and foremost. They do this as other things as well. So this is the thesaurus for the controlled vocabulary to use for cataloging their holdings. And they also do it with time, so periods. They have a period vocabulary, and they have all sorts of those kinds of different systems. Also built with different grant money and at different times. So you don't need to do all of this all at once. So it's really a start of building where you can build something. And now if you go to another component, which is called Arachne, this is their search portal for the objects, it's the object database. It looks pretty conventional. So it's basically you search for something, you get a result page. But if you know where to look, the knowledge graph is pretty much everywhere. So you have here, which says buildings, which is linked because it's one of the concept terms from the Achwort, from their thesaurus. Or here, of course, you have, so that's the item. Every item, of course, also has a URI. And here you have the place, which again is linked to the gazetteer. Here you have the time periods. And again, so they're starting to build this up, and it becomes more ingrained in the infrastructure and in the institute. It's being used more and more, and it becomes a central component. Yeah, and that's basically why we advocate for it. So on the one hand, in the institution, it has a benefit, but also I think you have to think of it as a benefit to the outside world. So if you want your data to be sustainable, first and foremost, I think you have to make it usable for other people. So if people can't discover it, if people can't download it, and if people can't sort of mix it with other source material, then it's not very usable, and it's probably not going to be used, and you have difficulty arguing to your management to say why you need funding to keep the infrastructure running. So sustainability and usage, there is definitely a relation to that. And common formats and conventions help, I think, to achieve reusability. Yeah, the other thing, I think this is less relevant for bigger institutions about publishing data, because big institutions already do that. But for smaller scholarly endeavors and smaller projects, they often they write their grant, they say, we're going to build a website and people will have an API. But in the end, after the project's over, the website dies or it's not being maintained anymore. So we also tell people that you should also publish data. Not just the website and the results, but also sort of the plain data that people can download as a whole and then do something with it. Using URIs, using common vocabularies. And last but not least, it's also a philosophy thing, I think. It's about sharing the data, being okay with other people reusing this, and offering it in different ways. Yeah, so that basically is the end of my talk, or what I wanted to say. Just coming back to the Pelagios network, it's a non-profit association, so there are no membership fees or anything involved. It's really sort of a loose couple of people talking about issues of place in the ancient world. It's going to be officially founded in the next weeks, if people can get the the rule framework together. We wanted to release it, I think, 2 weeks ago, but there are always discussions about things. But basically, it's now really close to being an official association. It's simply a platform for the development and exchange of best practices, and it's about really also fostering new partnerships, about finding partners to write grant proposals really as well. And it's a place to find people who have used a certain technology, who know something about the technology or a tool, who can change, who can explain things that you might not know already, sort of an express exchange. Yeah, and last but not least, we also have, it's difficult, we have initiated a conference which is called Linked Pasts. The first Linked Past conference, I think we can say, was sort of the Pelagios conference, but definitely from the second conference onwards, it was really more of its own thing, a community-driven conference where Pelagios is really just a member, so we're still supporting it. This year is going to be the 5th in the series, and it's going to be in France, so in Bordeaux. So if you have the time or the chance, then definitely do visit us. I think it's on the 11th of December, so the date is already set, but I didn't know it off the top of my head. But it's going to be in the first half of December. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have questions for me.
Any question?
There is questions for Rainer? Also. Oh, you can.
Thank you first. And then maybe just before we start in anything, before I can start to ask anything concrete, I'd like to, would you be able to just explain a little bit more what you mean by geometry in the model? Because I'm not entirely sure I understood that, and maybe that would help me a little more to catch what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, geometry essentially is understood in the way that GeoJSON, the GeoJSON framework, allows it. And it's really just points, polygons, and lines on the surface of the Earth or at a certain height of the Earth in different reference systems. So GeoJSON can support different geographical reference systems, although first and foremost you use the kind of Google Maps coordinates, so WGS84. Kind of if you're coming from a GIS perspective, it's that kind of notion of geometry, or how a GIS system thinks of it. It's really lines, points, and polygons on the planet. Yeah.
Another question? Well, I will start with my questions. Well, thank you again, Rainer. It was very, very interesting to see all of this development. I was wondering about the work, how the community works, because it's been many years that you're working together with this new team. There are people that are coming, new scholars that are integrating the community. How I think it's an example of a successful initiative, and that brings new people every time. And I just would like to have more information about how do you manage to keep this going?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is really basically the association that's coming. So formally the way it's worked was really on a very personal level. So we had the conferences, we had lots of conference talks at various avenues, and then people would start to engage with us. And we had a website for a while which has a public forum and a mailing list, and this is still how it works at the moment. But because it's becoming more and more, we also see that we need a bit of an open process rather than just emailing back and forth, which was really one of the key things how it has worked so far. Yeah, I think the association is an answer to this thing just growing more, decentralizing it more, getting more people involved also in sort of coordination roles. And just to say a little bit about the association, for the first instance, there will be 6 activities, which are sort of more interest group-like constructs, where 2 people have volunteered to be the coordinators. Everything will work via public emailing lists, but basically it's working still sort of about a thematic level. So there will be those activities. People who are interested in the activity just join, start a discussion. And then I think there's also definitely a plan to have activities, get their own events on linked paths, but also maybe encourage people to do things like workshops co-located with conferences and establish this kind of personal interchange as well. So virtual and personal, both ways.
Okay. Want to ask Nathalie first? Ladies first.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, what are you planning to do with the traces data? Do you plan to make some special analysis on them, some inference on them? Do you want to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, like with the gazetteers, I'm not sure inference is always possible across datasets. It's certainly possible within a dataset where you control the vocabulary. So for the time being, the Pittsburgh project will also index traces. So you can submit traces to Pittsburgh and make them discoverable. What else we're going to do with that, I think, is still very much open. I would definitely be interested in sort of thinking about tools for working with traces and doing inference on that. But again, it's still open. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And also, just to come back, I think it's also sort of a process where we always had this philosophy of we collect some data first, try to build something and sort of trigger ideas around that, and then think further. And then again, refine the model, maybe find where we need to be more specific with the recommendations. It's sort of an iterative process that comes from collecting data first, going ground up, and then sort of iterating. And I think for traces, it will be somewhat the same.
Thank you very much, Rina. It's been a really fascinating and very instructive presentation. I have a question on this kind of material, printed or manuscript map, because the way we describe a place on such material is basically XY position on a file, a scanned file, but we know that there are many versions according to library systems of scanned maps available online, and there is no real referential scan of a map. So is there a way of making a kind of grid of a document that can be adapted to different digital version of a document? It could be a challenge, but maybe useful.
I don't think there's a generic solution to that, but you can definitely reference one copy of a scan to another one. But it's really like georeferencing, only that you're not georeferencing to the real world, but between maps. I mean, I know that people have done this actually with our tool. We had a scholar who worked on the Gough map, sort of in this like 13th century British map, and they had an old scan and they annotated it fully with, I think it's like 800-900 toponyms and transcriptions, and they also recorded previous transcriptions from other scholars. So it was really a lot of work that's going in, and then they made a better scan. And then, of course, you know that the map is really old, it's warped, so it's not even just, you can't just skew it, that's not enough. But at least they could replace, so they could move at least the annotations. So at least if you have a tool, it's not the perfect solution, but if you have the annotations from one copy, at least going to another copy is doable in a feasible amount of time, right? It's still, everything requires manual work, but at least you have a start and you can sort of start referencing to a new system. It's possible, but again, lots of sweat involved.
Could there be a smart way of coding
I think it depends on the map. I mean, sometimes you probably have something where you can work with a mathematical transformation. Sometimes that works, but sometimes it just doesn't. Sometimes you just have a border around it and a little bit of skew, and then you can really transform it. But sometimes it's really, you have a scan which is
not
just
only
10
scans,
years
but
newer,
there can be, this map could be printed in, not this, but another in 1790, 1793.
Of course,
it's not
of
exactly
course,
the
that's
same
another,
document,
exactly.
but
That's another scenario, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the conference. I was wondering, is there any way to make visible the scales in the gazetteer? For instance, if in one place, is there a tool that can list the different places, maybe in one place, and then see how? Because sometimes you have a notation on one specific place in one other place, big place like a city. So is the Pelagios working on this different occurrence of one citation in one place already, or is it only the big place that contains others? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Do you mean how we, for example, deal with gazetteers for a single city?
Yeah, in a city, if there's if we can have some other listed places, do you make any links? Is there like in the script, is there a possibility to show the different other places that are included in this link, in this place, and maybe regarding the source that we have, can we see how many times one spot, for instance, has been considered as englobing maybe the city, you know? I don't know if you...
Yeah, I think you meant about the inclusion relation between place and between places, if there is a way to explore this relation of inclusion, part of, I would say.
No, there isn't. I mean, in the model you can express relations like that, but there is no tool to actually visualize them at the moment. Also, so one of the activities that we have in Pelagios is specifically about urban gazetteers, so which is going to be much more about hierarchical relations and containment. And there are hopefully 2 projects coming up soon. So one's on Pompeii, which is a nice sort of testing site for a very micro gazetteer. And there's another thing which hopefully gets funding, which is on Ephesus, which is another classical site in Turkey, which would do essentially the same thing. And hopefully there will also be some tools coming out which might address this. But yeah, at the moment there is nothing on that end.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the data. Is the tool that is.
It's in the model. Yeah.
It's in the model.
Yeah.
Yeah. You had a question also?
I have a question about. I think there was a slide showing a road or a line. Is a line an object? Yes, that's it. So this line is data linked to the same road, or is a road an object you can identify and connect places with, or a river, for example? How will you describe a river and the different rivers connected to a river?
So in this case, it's not connected to a road, but it's sort of like one item, which is in this case an itinerary, a piece of literature, and it has annotations to all places. So it's many places. We have some roads in Peripleo where the road is actually the place. So the road has an identifier. You could link it there. So that's also possible. And rivers, yeah, it's the same thing like road. If you have, we have many rivers with their identifiers. We don't have geometries for all of them. So it's there's also having the identifier on the one hand, having the geometry on the other hand. I think for a long time Nile was a dot, really. So that's pretty disappointing if you're dealing with the ancient roads. Yeah. But yeah, so there was also one project which dealt specifically with the gazetteer of Roman roads in Spain. And now I think in France they want to even extend it. But yeah, so essentially it's all growing, right? So people are starting to come up with databases about different types of places, roads just being a specific type of place, and making those available as linked data so that you can also map this and use it for connecting things.
Yes, I guess if you have GIS data that describe these old roads, you would just link to your identifiers and...
Yeah, exactly. So especially for Roman roads, there's lots of scholarship, of course, and over the past decades, you get shape files and GIS data, but it's just not linked data. So people are starting to produce this, make it more shareable.
At least adding the identifier to the road that is described in the Pelagios infrastructure. Is there another questions?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering, maybe a question around the topic of post-colonialism, and in the idea of maybe two questions around that, as in with the perspective of trade to kind of shift the center of study. There's a question that asks which material places do you work on, which places have you modeled, whether you in Pelagios or in the other larger project of the World Gazetteer. And also which perspectives and which different experts are the ones who make those different connections between the traces and the places, and which people actually end up defining what a trace is as well, as in selecting those particular traces. Mainly from, a question as in who makes the data that you're talking about.
Yeah, so for Pelagios, it's always been very community-centric. So it's really a small data set from a specific project or historian, and it always retains the identity. So it is coming from a specific person, essentially, and that information is still sort of in the data. So yeah, I would say for Pelagios, it's centered around the source or the source data set or the people producing that data set. And again, also Peripleo is really just a search engine. So you find something and you go redirect it to the website of the project. For the World Historical Gazetteer, I would say it's more source-driven. So they nail the data set down to a specific source. So there is, for example, a gazetteer being built for Latin America. And that's based around something called, for example, the Alcido Gazetteer, which is a historical gazetteer. So it's not so much about building a general gazetteer, but having this historical source. And this historical source makes one part of the World Historical Gazetteer. So the identity essentially is the source. And in Pelagios, the identity is essentially the scholars delivering this.
Yes, thank you. Sorry because I arrived late, so I hope you haven't spoken about that before I came. I would like to know how you deal with the temporal, so with chronology, because in the specification you can say a time span or a date associated with any information you have them, but how do you deal with that? Is there a way of when you have the data of using it, do you have some tools so that you can make comparison throughout time in the evolution? So I have a true geohistorical vision of the places, because you have the information in, but how do you get out something that you can just help have a deeper understanding of the history of space?
Well, there are some experimental tools for basically having a combined timeline and map visualization. So that exists as an early prototype where you can dump the data in and you can see sort of this kind of chronologies as bars on the timeline, and you can move through it and you can basically see the changes on the map. So there is some sort of rudimentary tooling around that. Yeah, but that's early days for sure.
I was wondering about the use of literary sources. So you said that you actually track places mentioned in a book, for example. I was wondering if you also track where the book was published, or the editions, the circulation.
No, not at the moment. So one thing where we're trying to go with our annotation tool, Recogito, is that they can upload their source material, and they might end up uploading different kinds of editions of the same work, for example. And I think it would be really interesting to, at least if they make this work open, so in Recogito you have sort of a closed workspace, but you can also publish the data openly. And we are starting to work a little bit more around search tools where you can find what kind of versions of a book are in there, for example, and make comparisons. So I think it's going a little bit into this direction. But still, so the metadata functionality in Recogito is sort of limited, and I think it's going to stay that way. So because the community is just very heterogeneous as well. But yeah, it's definitely something which we want to explore, but probably more on a simpler level, because we can see that people are working on the same things, and basically we're trying to give them the tools to discover what other people are working with, and the tools to basically get into contact and get into discussion, and maybe sort of facilitate collaboration around different sources or different editions of the same source and so on. There is an edition field in the metadata, but yeah, no structured kind of requirements that are being enforced.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the circulation of a particular book that mentions, you know, a specific place and kind of things related to the materiality of the book. And
I mean, again, you could model it in the model, I guess, but yeah, but it's not a case that we've actively explored so far.
Right, too specific.
Yeah. Thank you.
And if you want to discuss with us or with him, you can come here. It's been a long day for Rainer especially.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again, everyone, for coming. And
thank you.
Thank you, Rainer.